Hey everyone, today we're talking with Bill Kenney from Focuslab. Focuslab is an agency that focuses on B2B branding, and they have some amazing work. I mean, I've been following them for I think over a decade now, and they're a really fascinating agency. And Bill is actually the one of the co-founders. And so we talk a lot about how they set up their process, how they stay creative, how they work with B2B brands, how they use strategy, and a lot more. But first, let's just dive in with their reel, which is pretty cool, and then let's have the interview.
Sometimes it appears that we're reaching a period when our senses and our minds will no longer respond to moderate stimulation. We seem to be approaching an age of the gross.
So my name is Bill Kenney. I am the Chief Creative Officer, also one of the co-founders at Focuslab. The short version is Focuslab is a brand agency, which is why I'm here today.
Yeah, awesome. I mean, I've been a huge fan of Focuslab since I don't know, since forever. It's really like one of those agencies when I was like a young designer, like looking up to Focuslab. So really happy to chat with you today. Could you tell us a little bit more about Focuslab, just so people get an idea?
Yeah, sure. Yes, because you use the word brand agency, right? It can mean a lot of different things.
Yeah.
So, so what would I say in a nutshell? Focuslab is a brand agency, right? We're 19 people now. We're 10 years old. We work primarily in the B2B space, which you'll see as we're kind of scrolling through the site here. It's a lot of B2B technology, even more specifically. In the old world, maybe even a couple years ago, we'd say we were located in Savannah, Georgia, although our clients are everywhere, quite literally. The internet makes that possible for a small company like us. And now post-COVID, we are not located in Savannah, and we can get into the nuances of that, and it might not even be important for this call, but yeah. So small, powerful team, really great, down-to-earth people, just passionate about branding.
How many people are on your team?
So 19 as it sits today. We definitely plan to grow this year. Our goal is not to be a humongous agency, but to do the kind of work that we want to do, we need to be a little bit bigger so that we can remove the multiple hat syndrome that happens in a smaller company, get really people like in specific lanes only.
Cool. Like you're talking about branding, and I see also communications and some other services and strategy, of course, on your website. Just briefly try to like tell me what branding is to you, because it's a word that we use a lot, but like, what does it mean to you?
Yeah, great question. So when I'm using the word brand, I am speaking about all of those aspects, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when we started this company, all of the aspects, meaning everything that you've just spoken to that you saw on our site, communications, the strategy work, the visual identity, all the expressions of a brand that we can affect, that is within our wheelhouse, we want to affect. There's certainly other stuff that we wouldn't do. But so what does brand mean to us? What I was going to say is, when we started the company, branding was logos, right? It was that kind of like elementary vision of or understanding of what brand means. And now 10 years in, it obviously means a lot more to us. So the things that we tackle heavily, and this is a bit of our process in a way, which is leading out with strategy. So you've got your heavy kind of discovery and strategy portion of the project, identifying where was that company, why are they trying to change, what are they looking to achieve, what's the new vision, and then using that as the framework for both visual identity and verbal identity.
Yep.
So we want to capture how it looks and we want to capture how it sounds.
Interesting. Yeah, I love that. Walk us through like a project at Focuslab, and probably there's like no one project, but like maybe you mentioned some steps, but like could you walk us through some of the things that you always do on each project?
Yeah. So our workflow, what does that look like? It follows a very particular form now. We consider our process to be very important to us and therefore the customer, and that's a big part of what we sell when we're talking to new potential partners. So the process, I don't want to go super granular. I guess stop me and tell me to go more granular because I don't know how far I should go. But if we want to stay a little bit kind of mid-tier, so we're going to start in that strategy phase, like I said. So that will land on the strategy team. We're big enough now to have different departments in the organization. It's not just a designer running strategy. There are strategists solely dedicated to that. Strategists work with writers because in the beginning, in that early portion of the project, and why would a writer be in there? Because story is paramount in a brand, right? Brands are not just flashy colors and logos. There has to be some sense of a story and a purpose. So the strategist, in collaboration with a writer, will start to formulate that idea, that concept. We have meetings internally in the organization, concepting meetings that we actually bring larger groups of people in just to manifest ideas, get more things on the table. But it is still ultimately the strategist and the writer's job to distill that and come up with the more pure, refined story. That goes through weeks of not necessarily iteration, but weeks of doing and working and then shipping to the client, having conversations around it, making sure that we're going down the right path. Okay, now let's just consider the strategy as approved, the story and the direction of where we're going is approved. Then that now hands off to two other tracks, if you will, which would be visual identity and then more of the verbal identity. So how do we build off of the story, positioning, all of those types of elements? Verbal identity is going to be how do you sound, what's your tone, those types of phrases, like even down to like mission statements and those types of things, really working on those. Even thinking about the content that lives on your site, which even gets more into like information architecture, which is at the back end of both of these things kind of that I'm talking about, which would be web work. But then I think the thing that most people are attracted to, unfortunately, we're going to do our best to kind of reshape that, which is the visual identity portion. What does it actually look like? What does a brand look like? So then that runs for weeks on end. I mean, I could give you an average length. I don't know if that's important, but I mean, you might be looking 12 weeks total on certain projects. Some certainly run longer, a few run shorter, but not at our age and size. Not many run too much shorter than that. Gone are the days of a 4-week brand project at Focuslab. That just doesn't exist anymore. You can't do all those steps in 4 weeks, nor can the client have feedback cycles and do the homework that we need them to do to get all the information we need to extract, et cetera, et cetera.
Sounds awesome. Like, has your process been changing a lot throughout the years? Because, for example, I still remember like having a conversation with Summer Teal. I don't know if she's still on the team actually, but like she mentioned back in the day that the strategy process was only just growing within Focuslab, and like take us through Focuslab 5 years ago and now, like what has changed and how has that impacted the way you work with clients?
It's evolving out of that. Brands are logos or visual manifestations, and doing all the other parts that really make a brand what that is. So if you're talking 5 years ago, I mean, at that point, I don't even think we were even considering writing. That might have been the time we were starting to tiptoe into writing, to say we need a writer.
Mm-hmm.
But that writer was still, it wasn't necessarily like copywriting, but it was probably closer on that side of the spectrum than it was of like brand storytelling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I think that's such an interesting move. And I've seen that personally, and also at the agency I've been working, but I'm doing freelance stuff now. But like the idea of going from branding to strategy, and then at a certain point, taking into consideration all of the comms, like the whole communication spectrum, I think that's almost like a natural move if you really want to do branding well and if you want to do brands well. But like,
that's right.
If let's say somebody's watching this and he or her is interested in learning more about the comms part, like maybe what would be some tips from your end, from being more of a branding person, a visual person?
Yeah, so I guess I would say a couple things. I am reading a book, and I came prepared. I almost feel ashamed to show this book because it's probably a book I should have read 7 years ago, being that the company's 10 years old. This should have been like high on my radar and all that. But when you're building a business and you're just a young designer and you don't know what the hell you should be doing, you don't have as much time to focus maybe on certain things.
There are so many books anyway. I mean, you can't
right.
All right.
At that point, you're still just like designing the hell out of everything, trying to make a paycheck. Yeah. You're not really building this larger thinking. But I would say I'm just about halfway through this book. And I think this brings a lot of value in that comms world, right? Like, what's the story? He's not preaching design specifically in this book. He's preaching a story framework.
Yep.
How do you get somebody pulled into a story? And I think, it's funny, I'm reading that book. I'm going to suggest that the strategy team members read that. I'm also going to suggest that our head of growth, which is our other partner, will read that as well. Because there's a lot of like how you even speak to a potential customer. To tell them what you do and what you're willing or what you're going to offer and those types of things. So I guess that's all I could offer on the, hey, comms people, this is what you should do. Just to note, though, it has been an interesting transition for us. We knew that comms would be really important at Focuslab, and we were willing to go there, even though our clients weren't particularly those clients yet. Like, we were having to sell them to say, like, hey, you need this. And they're like, well, why do we need that? Now, a couple of years later only, all of our clients want that, and they would almost look at us weirdly if we didn't have that. So it's been interesting to see that happen.
Yeah, and I think it's this thing we struggle with when we're doing branding. We always want to like impact all touch points because we believe a brand is all of those things. And then it begs the question, like, do we need to become this full service thing where we're even doing like the social media marketing and then we become a marketing agency? Like, what's your take on that? Like, how do you deal with that? Because you've been around in this for a long time.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic business question. Like, what's the business model? And I think that there is that like shiny, you see something shiny, you're attracted to it, kind of like, a fish to a lure type of thing. Like, oh, we could do that. We could do this. And we had that for many years, right? Even in the early years, you're like, well, clients need hosting. They need all these other things. Like, if we're building their website, why aren't we doing hosting? Because we can make, monthly revenue that's passive, if you will, but it's not when their site goes down on Saturday at midnight. So you learn a lot of those things over time. And we now, 10 years in, absolutely realize that we can only be so much, and we only want to be so much. We know what we're passionate about. We know where the line in the sand is, and we can say, okay, this is where we can take you to. So what we focus on is basically essentially building the foundation, using the strategy, building the new visual expression of the brand. How does it sound? How does it speak? And then handing that off. That line is not always clear, though, because there's also like rollout planning, but we don't get into SEO. We don't get into social media, like marketing and all that, right? There's a difference between building a brand and then the marketing efforts, which happen directly in line with that brand, or just are like a spin-off, which is just a marketing campaign which is a part of the brand, which might be down to a product level. So we draw the line before all that stuff happens. In at the size of our customer base now, that is an appropriate line for them too. They don't want us to stay on. They don't want us to be everything. They already have companies to do those other things, which is perfect for us.
Yeah, that sounds great. And I think that's a struggle a lot of people have when they're doing brand strategy and like where do we stop? Because it is sometimes tricky. Like, do you want to roll out the brand? That's something you probably maybe want to get a little bit involved in still, or maybe at least have some oversight over, but then where does it stop? And I think it also has to do a lot with the size of the companies you're working with. As you mentioned, if they have internal teams or partnerships, that's a lot different from a startup that needs you to do like anything. And I guess maybe that's where I'm also interested in with, because you mentioned B2B, like, do you think there's a difference in approach to B2B or B2C, or is it like, is branding for all of these companies the same?
So that's a good question. Sure, there are differences, but more importantly, we're all speaking to people, right? It doesn't matter is the business the consumer, or is it, a consumer like myself buying an Apple product? You're still just communicating to people. So I would say on the highest level, the most value you're going to get is focusing on that and not getting too lost in the, well, it's B2B, we got to speak slightly different. It's like, okay, yeah, like carve out those nuances, but that's the 20% of the 80% of the value. Focus more on the story, right? Like regardless of B2C, B2B, like the story is most important. And then weave in maybe your nuances of industry and stuff like that. We do help in the rollout. The way we help is more of a supportive service to say, hey, we've just created this new framework, this new brand visual, these comms. How are you going to execute all this stuff now? We don't need to come up with a marketing campaign necessarily, but you've got all these things you need to update, even just purely with this new visual style guide and communication style guide. That updating takes a lot of muscle, and you might not have that muscle on your team. So we can supplement for a certain period of time post-project to stay with us, and we'll basically serve as like your extended design team. All your ebook covers and all this stuff that's like not necessarily hard work, it's just time consuming as all heck. We'll stay on and do that. So that is how we continue to help our customers, because we want to do that, right? Like we're failing at our job if we're just shipping all this stuff off that we're really proud of and we think is beautiful, but they can't execute on it. They can't roll it out properly, even just purely from we don't have the muscle to do it.
Yeah, and I think that's a struggle we all have. Like when we're doing branding, we create this beautiful thing, and then it gets implemented and we see it come alive, but sometimes it gets destroyed all around. Like how do you deal with the handoff, and how do you make sure a brand stays alive in the way you've originally envisioned it? Or is that just not possible?
Well, it is possible to affect it. Is it possible to cure it with a silver bullet? No. But it's funny, because we'll also, if I just want to categorize us all as designers for this example, like we designers will sit around and go like, oh, they ruined it. They did it wrong. And it's like, okay, well, that's one emotion you could have. Or you could say, what could I have done better to affect this positively? And I think, now being, again, 10 years old now, being more mature in how we think, that's why we created this other service. Because we realized like, well, we have a part to play in this. Like, how can we affect this positively and make it so that is at least less likely? Doesn't mean it's not going to happen, but it would be less likely. So I always use the analogy of it's like we hand off this Ferrari to somebody that we know can't drive stick, but we're saying it's a Ferrari, it should be stick or standard. And therefore you're going to get more power out of it if it's stick, but you can't drive it, but just learn. It's like, well, how do we like soften that blow for them so they don't have to go out and crash a lot? And that's why we want to stay on and soften that experience, because ultimately that experience still ties back to us. We could do a fantastic job, but if they're not set up for success, that is still in a way a negative experience to us. Even if they don't connect that dot, they might just say, oh, we screwed it up. Well, that's still our failing. So we want to do as much as we can to support that, not pout about it on the back, behind the curtain.
Yeah, I think that's something that's also in strategy something very important. And I've noticed when working with B2B companies, like they're very interested in generating leads and making sure
Hmm.
it's sometimes it's a very technical thing. And when you're
Yep.
doing brand strategy for them and you're talking about story and like bringing it to life, sometimes you hit this point where it's like really hard because you're like on different planets. Like, how do you make sure the story comes alive in a more human way with this very sometimes technical sort of stuff you're working with?
That's a great question. For some companies, it is much harder than
Mm-hmm.
others because they're highly technical. I mean, there was a spree of work that we did that was all, it was data, big data, data this, data that, right? And
Yeah.
that can only be so human, seemingly.
Mm-hmm.
Thankfully, we live in a world now that has a strong hunger for a human appeal, which is why
Yeah.
you see every big tech company trying to soften their visuals, soften their tone, illustrations everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
You know, people want to be more approachable. IBM would want to be more approachable. Apple is approachable, you know, so everyone's trying to model that. So
Yeah.
therefore, I do think it makes our job easier when we still get hit up by a big technically driven B2B company. They actually still want an appeal that I think is deliverable. So the
Mm-hmm.
challenge isn't maybe as big as you might think. You know, they're
Yeah.
saying right now we're too technical, soften us up.
Mm-hmm.
That's
That's
easier for
probably
us.
that's probably why they come to you, right? Because that's I think
Exactly right.
really interesting. If I look at your portfolio, I mean, it looks so fun and the work really is alive. And I think when you mention like it's a B2B branding agency, you wouldn't expect that sort of work to come out. And I think that's always something I've really appreciated with Focus Lab. Like the you see the material, what it's about, it's quite serious stuff, but you manage to bring that alive. And I think that's probably because of the people you have and some other like the way you work. But that's maybe something we could talk about as well. Like, how do you make sure every time a branding project looks creative, looks different, has its own style? Like, how do you make sure you don't end up in that, hey, that's a Focus Lab project, hey, that's another Focus Lab project, and it
Mm,
looks the same? Like, because it
yeah.
doesn't. Your work really is diverse, I think, in terms of how you approach it. So I don't know, what's your take on that?
So I'm just writing one thing down because I want to make sure I capture something that you said,
Yeah.
which is important to me. Um, you've hit the nail on the head, which is this idea that B2B is boring. Why?
Yeah.
Anything can be boring, right? Like fun brands can be boring if they're not executed well. So it's funny, right? Because
Yeah.
we recognize that we could be positioned well. Here's another book, Q book, um,
Oh yeah.
Ocean Strategy,
Somewhere over there.
fantastic.
Yeah.
So what's our blue ocean? I'm not suggesting right now that our blue ocean is B2B, but it is a smaller ocean, right? We can say
Hmm.
we're positioned more over here. And when we started to kind of dribble that idea out there, myself included, but you know, our team as a whole was kind of like, ooh, but that won't mean we get cool, fun projects. But what you're saying is exactly right. And was kind of like our theory, which is like, but why? B2B companies need to be awesome as well. It doesn't mean that they can't be creative and engaging and all these other things. So now a snowball is happening because we have B2B on our portfolio and it looks like that. Other B2B companies that want to look like that come to us, so we get to kind of like stay in that world. We do not want to take on a project that just wants to be, you know, another boring blue lack of life type of tech company, and nobody really wants to be that anymore. So for that regard, I think we're positioned well. Your other question: how does our projects not all look the same?
Hmm.
I think the key there is just diversity of team
Yep.
on our team, and I want to be clear that like diversity is a big word right now, and we are tuned into it, and we're not tone deaf. But when I say diversity of team, we're still a largely white male team. So I have to be
Hmm.
careful in how I kind of define diversity. When I use, and we're working against that right now in a positive way. Like, you know, we're making our change. When I say diversity of team, it's design talent and styles. So you've got
Yes.
certain projects that come in the door and you know that they're going to align with a certain style, typography taste, color palette taste. with this particular team member. It's not always how we connect the dots project to team member, but it does result in an outcome that you're speaking of, which is, back in the day when I was on projects, most of those were going to be a pretty minimal, clean outcome. With certain types of type style, certain types of color palettes, as opposed to, say, a team member like a Chase on a project or a Joshua on a project. Two of the design team members now, their styles are just different from mine. And I also want to be clear to say that your own personal style shouldn't just be what the client gets, because you should be giving them what they need per the strategy, but your style affects it, right? It definitely comes out in that. So therefore you see diversity in the Focuslab catalog.
No, but I mean that's interesting, and I think that's a struggle for people that maybe are solo, they're one freelancer studio, and that's where I've been working, looking a lot at working with other people, with illustrators and interesting people visually, because it is true, you can't manage to do all brands if you're honest about it, because sometimes you need something else. And maybe one thing to add on top of that, or a question is, do you work with multiple designers on one project, and do you let them develop different visual directions and then pick from that? Or is it just one direction you work on?
Good question. And I'm going to go ahead of that a little bit, or behind it, which is back to where we were. Multiple people. So how do I say this? If there's a project, and per strategy and per the visual direction, it's going down a path of oh man, it's going to be a logo type. It's going to be heavy typographically driven. And say I'm on it, which I wouldn't be now, but if I was on it, I'd be like, oh, that is the right strategy, but that's going to be really hard for me to execute. Thankfully, we have a team. We can look around and say who on the team either has time, bandwidth, et cetera, to jump into this thing and help me. I can do the other parts of it, but I can't make the custom logo type. Maybe I can pass that off to somebody like Chase on the team, who lives and dies by typography. So we do leverage the team, but more specifically to your other question, do we have multiple designers on every project? Really, we would say no, but I think to the outside world, it's kind of yes. It's no with a hint of yes. So there's a design lead, right? So if I'll just use Chase again, if Chase is on a project, he is responsible. He's the accountable party for that visual design of the project. It does not mean that we don't have jam sessions where we all get together for an hour and just riff in Illustrator and then say, upload all your Illustrator files to Dropbox, and Chase can pull whatever he wants off of those. Or Chase might say, hey, I'm really struggling to come up with a mark, but I got everything else secure. Can I have some other people jump in and help with mark ideas? So we collaborate in that way. But technically speaking, there is a single designer on the track of that project. Our partners know, though, that we are collaborative in that way. So they know that they are still getting the benefit of the team, although they only meet with the one designer, the one PM, the one strategist in their weekly meeting.
Yeah, I love that. That's really interesting. I'm a bit jealous. I've been working solo for a while now, and I feel like that would be really cool. Even if I'm just collaborating with an illustrator, it's so exciting to work together and throw your ideas around. And I think that brings forward the best results for sure. Maybe to start wrapping this up, because I think we've already seen some interesting stuff. I'm wondering, because this interview is happening somewhere in January, it's always a time where we look back and we also look forward. What have you seen in terms of branding that's been happening, and maybe what do you think is going to happen in the future? Maybe what are some things you've been paying attention to that stand out for you?
All right. Good question. So I'm not going to position myself here as some prophecy that understands where we're going. Sure. I do know where our company is going, and I think that is as a result of where I think the industry is going.
Exactly.
So we want to position ourselves as the most powerful type of brand agency that we can be. It doesn't mean we're going to be the best. How do you even score the best? We're not going to get lost in that trap of, who has more awards or who works with bigger names. But how can we create the best outcome? And like I've continued to say during this podcast, which is a more well-rounded service. It's not, can we just do more design? It's what are all the other parts that make this thing more powerful, this thing being brand. And what we've recognized is there definitely is a gap of this, the more of the strategic thinking work. There's plenty of agencies doing great design, right? And I tell the team all the time, like, we're not going to go out there and compete on design because, man, that's going to be a rat race. We need to be really good at what we're doing. But that needs to be table stakes or writing and all those things. It's the thinking, it's the strategic measures, and what we haven't talked about yet, and what we're going to try to introduce at Focuslab is this whole idea of getting even ahead of strategy and working with organizations to talk about, let's talk about your core values. Let's talk about like why you even exist. Has that changed in the last 10 years? What is your why? If you want to get into the whole Start With Why, Simon Sinek TED Talk, which is worth watching. I think those types of things create a better outcome. Does that show where brand is going? No, I do believe that everyone's becoming really wise to the idea that brand is potentially the most important thing they can invest in. So I do see the world headed in that direction, right? What else are you going to compete on? You're going to compete on price. You're just going to race to the bottom. Like, you're going to compete on features. You can make 28 more features. So what do you compete on? You got to build a brand that separates, which is what? It's rooted in purpose. It's rooted in some type of core value and belief that people align to. We buy Tesla because we believe we want that type of world. That's not, melting down because of oil and gas refineries type of thing. We want electricity and we want sustainability. And all. So that's why we would choose, if priced equally and designed equally, we would still choose Tesla over, Chevy. Sorry, Chevy. So I do believe the world is headed there more quickly because the writing's on the wall. Early, Apple was able to step out on the edge and be like, this is what we care about. We're about brand. We're not going to tell you about processors and all these things. Everyone's like, oh, it's almost like a lifestyle brand. If you could think about like, Apple at that time, they were kind of solo. Now everyone's looking at them going, they're the most valuable company in the world. Oh, that's what they did. So for that reason, I actually feel really thankful because it's like, well, great. Then our market should be wide open for a long time as everybody realizes brand is everything.
Love that. Yeah, I think I mean, that's very interesting. And on the one hand, I agree on it. And I think it's like investing in brand long term is always like a smart play. On the other hand, there is also this thing where I feel a little bit of friction when you mention that, in the sense that there is also this problem where a lot of companies start seeing this purpose thing, but they like try to do it. They find out a purpose, but it doesn't feel all that good. And that's where you see a lot of like just purpose washing, or whatever you want to call it. And it does feel like, I think that's a bit of a problem where a lot of brand strategists are looking at stuff like Simon Sinek, but then it stays on the surface level. And I think that's where there are some problems, like when it doesn't like pour over into communications and behavior and actual doing stuff, and it just becomes this thing like, we are the blah 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 for blah blah blah. That's where I think that there's some issues for sure.
Yeah, it just comes down to the authenticity. It is either true or it's not true. And ultimately, like, even an organization like us can't affect that. We can try to draw out what is that purpose, but if they don't live up to it and it is not authentic or even true, it won't work. Exactly. But for the ones that it is, it's magnetic, right? It's undeniable. It works.
Exactly. And I love that you mentioned that, like, you can draw it out, but it's not that you are creating it. And I think that's something important we need to realize when we're thinking about this purpose stuff. It is that it's really about like unearthing instead of just creating something that sounds cool.
Right. Yeah.
Awesome. Maybe one more question to wrap this up. Like you've mentioned already a little bit about the future for Focuslab, but just for this year, like 2021, what are your ambitions? What are your goals?
Yes. Okay. So there, I've been thinking about this a lot, obviously, as was one of the owners, and it's a new year and COVID's not behind us, but there's just something about a new year on a calendar that you're like, oh, okay, I can breathe and like we can like restart this thing. So I think what you're going to see out of Focuslab, I know, you're going to see a ton of this type of content. Yeah, I don't know that everybody needs to stand up and cheer when they hear that because there's so much content out there, but we're going to do our best.
Have a soundboard.
See, people love it. So an important part for us is we are passionate about what we do. We're convicted about the value that it brings. So how do we get in front of more people?
Yep.
This will be a way that we do it. Conversations like this, talking about the value of brand, why it's important, talking about process and the hiccups within a process, et cetera, et cetera. So you're going to see a ton of content out there from us in this way, speaking with ourselves, maybe interviewing past partners and talking about their projects and the ups and downs of it, and just trying to be really vocal, really transparent. So you'll see a huge presence from us in that way. The second thing that I'm really excited about, I don't even know if it's second. This is probably first. We're rebranding ourselves right now. We are at the tail end of Focuslab's rebrand. What an interesting, fun, challenging exercise to rebrand yourself as a branding agency.
It's such a hard thing to do, right?
Yeah. So that will roll out. That targets end of Q1. So, I mean, we're really working hard to stick to that date, but that will happen this year regardless. That is 1,000% going to happen. There will be a new Focuslab brand, and that brand is meant to position us as all the things I've just said. More of a thought leader, more of a big thinker, not just a design agency, right? Like throw that word out. New visuals, new logo, new all the thing, new website, new positioning, B2B specific, all that type of stuff. So that's huge. And I guess the final thing I would say is we're really targeting growth. Like I said, we're 19 people now, which might sound big to some people, and it's going to sound really small to other people. It's taken us 10 years to get to 19. We've done low, like slow and steady growth, but we recognize we can get another strategist in, we can get another brand support team member in, like all these very key roles. That also allows for growth within the organization and a little bit more hierarchy, et cetera. So I'm excited for growth. I'm excited for our new brand, and I'm excited to make a ton of noise and put that in front of everybody.
Awesome. Well, I'm really looking forward to that rebrand. Maybe like hit me up when it happens and we can share some of it. That would be
absolutely
really interesting. And thank you so much for this conversation. I really appreciate you and the team at Focuslab. I think it's just an amazing agency and what you've been doing. So looking forward to seeing more of that content, and hopefully we can collaborate more.
Thanks a ton for having me. Happy New Year, everybody. I don't know when this will drop, but Happy New Year whenever it is.
And just one more thing, when people want to reach out to you specifically, Bill, where can they get in touch?
Yeah, so thanks. It's Bill S. Kenney. So that's BILLSKENNEY. That's basically everywhere. If you put an @ in front of that, you're going to find me on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram. I use that handle for everywhere I am.
Awesome.
And I'm an open book, fully transparent. Anybody feel free to hit me up at any time. I'm happy to chat.
Awesome. Bill, take care, man. Bye-bye. Nice talking.
Bye-bye. See you out there.